I am very pleased today to be joined by my friend Miguel Lopez. He has previously joined me on the show to help talk about the film Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. We have a really fun commentary track that you can listen to. And the reason why I have him here today is we've just finished the Animal Farm Book Club. If you're watching this later, just last weekend, I finished the last meeting of the book club. And I got a really interesting question from a listener. And what that listener asked was this person asked to remain anonymous, which is totally fine. You can always send in anonymous questions. This person said, hey, I know you're American, but you've been living in England for a while, and I've seen some memes on social media about the current prime minister, comparing him to Joseph Stalin. Since we've been reading Animal Farm, which is all about Stalin, would you mind talking about that a little bit? And I had to take a week or two to think about that because I usually avoid present day politics on this show. It's too divisive, and I just want people to come together over books. But I feel like Miguel can help me do this right. And all we're going to do is just sort of evaluate some of the accusations and be like, are they even fair? And then see how they compare to the Napoleon the pig, Joseph Stalin comparison in Animal Farm. So thanks again for joining me, Miguel. And do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? Tell everybody about your background.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Tiffany, for bringing me back. Background, Southern California, retired from Air Force a little bit ago, and just pursuing my PhD in history right now in the middle of prepping for a comprehensive exam. So it can get busy.
I appreciate you taking the time out. I know how busy you are right now with all that, so it's really kind of you. So I wanted to start briefly by we'll just gloss over the comparisons between Napoleon the pig and Joseph Stalin. The first description we get of him is here in chapter 2, and it says, preeminent among the pigs were two young boars named Snowball and Napoleon, whom Mr. Jones was breeding up for sale. Napoleon was a large, rather fearsome-looking Berkshire boar, the only Berkshire on the farm. Not much of a talker, but with a reputation for getting his own way. And what do you think about that comparison to Stalin, just in terms of his looks and personality?
He's not imposing physically, but he definitely has a strong, charismatic personality. He was able to uh, be very manipulative of his audience.
As the story progresses, Napoleon starts accumulating more and more special privileges to himself. He takes the milk and the apples. He ends up sending his kids to a special school, and basically he ends up making the pigs be like the super class above all of the plebs. And so, could you explain a few things about like how did Stalin kind of get his beak wet, get a few privileges for himself as well as his political class?
Since he accumulated pretty much supreme power, I mean, they even named in political science, it even named Stalinism after him. That he's able to accumulate such extreme amount of power that he's going to, like you said, wet his beak whenever he wants. One of his kids was able to get into an elite school. So, and it's interesting that it's the trend, right, where you are at least in propaganda fighting for the little man, fighting for the proletariat or the working class, but you take privileges upon yourself because you quote unquote need it in order to run the country. So there is some similarities there that as the front, they're all the same, but in the back, because they have the responsibilities of the government to run the government, they give themselves extra privileges that are denied others.
That's exactly the kind of thing that there's this pig character called Squealer who's like the communicator, and he goes down and talks to all the other animals, and he explains why the pigs need to live in the farmhouse and why they need to sleep in the beds, and why Napoleon needs to have all the money and everything. It's exactly what happens in the book. That's a one-to-one relationship there. I wanted to talk up a little bit about this is obviously a much larger topic than we have time for today, but his approach to democracy and civil rights. So in Animal Farm, you have a steady erosion of democracy where at first there's these collective meetings that all the animals meet together as equals. Nobody is physically or socially above anyone else. They meet in the barn. they put together propositions and then they all get a vote. So even the animals that aren't as smart, and the book is quite clear that lots of the animals are pretty dumb, but they still have a say in their own society. And then eventually the meetings are abolished in favor of, they still get together and they still sing the song, but then the pigs just tell them what to do, because why would we bother voting? It's such a tedious waste of time, right? And then you just get this steady erosion, and eventually even the pigs exercise the powers of summary execution whenever they want, where they'll accuse animals or coerce like confessions out of animals and then just kill them on the spot. So how does that relate to Stalin's general approach to democracy and civil rights?
He called his democracy, and he said a socialist democracy or socialism democracy, where he believed that the Soviet Union was the most perfect form of democracy because it was democracy for the class. It was democracy for the group. He had to make compromises, but his idea was class democracy over individual democracy. So in order for the class, the proletariat, to be quote unquote free, individual liberalism, individual rights had to be sacrificed. So it was for the group, the individual needs to be sacrificed. But then again, because of the system, who made the decision to of what rights would be exist with Stalin himself. So it was, yes, class liberties, but completely determined on the whims of Stalin.
In the beginning of Animal Farm's early days, you had Napoleon representing Stalin, and then you had Snowball representing Trotsky, who were kind of co-leading. And the Trotsky character was very much concerned with stirring up rebellion on surrounding farms. Like, he thought that the way forward to ensure Animal Farm's safety and security would be if all of the animals in England rebelled, then, then we don't have a problem, right? Nobody's going to come after Animal Farm if all of the farms are now a socialist workers' paradise. And once Napoleon ran Snowball off the farm, very much in the same way that Trotsky was run out of the USSR, he really wasn't that concerned with the external world. As long as none of the animals left, one animal did leave, and that was, a very big deal. But the animals can't leave, and nobody comes in except for this one slimy lawyer that he does start working with. But he's not actually that interested in the outside world. And other than playing the other farmers off of each other, he really doesn't interact with the outside world. So I think Stalin, by necessity, was forced to interact with the outside world a little bit more. But I think probably the closest thing that I saw that might relate to him was the way that he manipulated these two rival farmers. Like, they want to buy this pile of wood, and so he engages in these protracted negotiations about which one's going to end up with it and which one is the enemy of the weak. And is that at all familiar to how Stalin ran things?
Yes, very definitely so. Now, again, he ideologically believed that there would be a worldwide revolution, a Bolshevik revolution, but it didn't pan out, right? It didn't happen. So he has to make pragmatic decisions on how to deal with the West, particularly Europe. Everybody saw the Soviet Union as dangerous after World War One. So in order to take the heat off of the Soviet Union, he had to play Europe against each other. So he made pragmatic decisions to align, specifically in that case of negotiating with two rivals. It specifically reminds me of right before the Second World War, the British and the French are trying to negotiate with Stalin to align Stalin against Germany. But Germany at the time, Hitler's trying to, start his war, and he actually makes a better deal with Stalin. So there is that dynamic in the last several weeks of August of 1939. Hitler surprises the world and makes an alignment with Stalin, and Stalin takes it because he's able to get whatever he wants on his side of the border. So, yes, so there's this, Stalin is pragmatic. Okay, there's not going to be a worldwide Bolshevik revolution. What I'll do is I will see who gets me the better deal for what he wants. The British and the French wouldn't do it. Hitler said, you can have your spheres of influence. You have the Molotov Pact right before late August of 1939. and Stalin just expects the West to fight each other to the death, and he'll just walk in. So yeah, he does definitely play both sides.
Napoleon doesn't give a lot of big speeches, and in fact, as the story goes on, he's seen less and less in public. At first, he participates in all the meetings, but he speaks very quietly, doesn't speak a lot. And then when there's this big debate over whether or not to build a windmill, and him and Snowball are fighting, the way he wins the argument is he lets Snowball give this big fancy speech, and everyone's all riled up and super excited. And then Napoleon just brings in this pack of dogs that he has brainwashed to be totally loyal to him. And the dogs literally just chase Snowball off the farm. And he's like, okay, I'm in charge now.
It reminded me of a statement of supposedly Stalin said this. I don't know if he said it before the war or after the war, where the Pope at the time, I forget who it was, is making, he made a big note of there should be democracy in Eastern Europe, I think specifically Poland. And so the Pope is trying to, push democracy. And supposedly Stalin says, well, how many army divisions does the Pope have? Not very much. So it's the same type of style of, it is brute force that Stalin uses. Now, again, like in the readings I looked up, is that he is somewhat soft-spoken in public and in private. He actually will he listens to what everybody else says, and then will take the popular opinion and call it for himself. So you have that kind of like, oh, that's a great idea, sir, even though you didn't come up with it. But Stalin is very brutal. He is paranoid to the point where, but he does gain his power through force, and eventually just forces people to, he's got the biggest army, he's got the biggest following, so he's gonna push people out.
Well, and he does literally stay in power until he drops dead. So I think we've gotten a pretty good idea of how Animal Farm is. It's directly portraying Stalin's leadership style and the regime that he set up, and that's exactly what Orwell set out to do. So now what I want to do is go back over these accusations of Keir Starmer, and you can find a lot of memes on the internet, not all of them G-rated. Some of them are cruel, some of them are pretty standard political satire in keeping with, say, the kinds of cartoons that used to be published in newspapers. But I wanted to go through that, and maybe let's just sort of evaluate if any of these accusations are fair. So we'll go back to the physical appearance. Stalin wasn't particularly tall, but he managed to portray himself like in portraits. He made himself look really tough and imposing. And I do have to say he had a pretty nice beefy mustache. So Starmer's not actually very tall. I don't know exactly how tall he is, but when I see him standing with other people on TV, 'cause you see him a lot on TV here, he doesn't look terribly imposing. This might make people angry that I say this, but he kind of looks like a bit of a dweeb to me. Like, just
Right.
I don't mean that in like the worst way. Like, just, he has a slightly nasal voice that people make fun of a lot. I would give him a friendly bit of advice to like just never walk into a working class bar in Pittsburgh, because even without trying to offend anyone, just by opening his mouth, because he somehow manages to sound pompous and dorky at the same time. But that's me as an American hearing him. And I know what's happening right now to any British people listening to this is they're like, well, what about Americans? Oh, no. Trust me. That's just not the subject of this conversation. Like, American politicians have the thing where they pretend to be more folksy than they really are. And then but still, yeah, you listen to like prime minister's questions, or they call it PMQs. And it's just like, there'll be one person standing at one box going, Mr. Speaker, and then the prime minister will be like, Mr. Speaker, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I can't stand any of this. This is really, really annoying. So I guess I'm curious, because I've been out of America long enough now that I don't know how certain things are perceived. How many people do you think like even really know who he is, or what do you think, like what's your opinion of him? How often do you see him on TV?
I see him whenever there's the few times he'll say something that he doesn't like the current administration and what they're doing. It's just going to be about NATO, or in this case, it's Iran and the troubles there. They will not know who he is. They probably think of him as, like you said, kind of nasal, kind of, pompous. I don't know, and this is kind of a question I was thinking about. Does he come across as effeminate in any way?
No, I would say he's actually a pretty standard version of British politicians. Like, the thing that I have noticed here is that whatever political party you're looking at, for the most part, they're all posh, they're all rich. He's the head of the Labour Party, which is supposed to be like the party of working people, but he has a knighthood and he's like a multimillionaire who lives in North London. The class system is very palpable. Like in America, we sometimes make the mistake of pretending we don't have a class system, and so we can ignore the issues that that causes. But here they're like, no, we totally have a class system, and all the posh people, no matter where they're from, they all sound the same. They all dress the same. So no, he strikes me as just kind of a very standard in terms of his appearance and behavior and the way he talks and all of that. But yeah, they kind of all sound that pompous to me.
It's interesting that you mentioned that he was from the Labour Party, which is supposed to be for the working class. But then you said he is educated, very educated, is rich and wealthy. There's that dichotomy that if you want to attribute it to Stalin or even the political class here, they always say, "Oh, we're for the working class, we're the proletariat, whatever language you want to use." But they're all in their Mercedes Benz. All their kids have, funds and go to college, and so there's that. Yes, I'm for the working class while I eat my caviar and you're eating at McDonald's every day. It doesn't. The presentation doesn't match the message.
No, it doesn't. And that actually goes into the next point that I was going to talk about, because we had gotten to, with Napoleon the pig and Joseph Stalin getting their beaks wet and having special privileges. And so right when Starmer was first elected, so I think this is an accusation against him that I personally feel is fair. When he was first elected, there was this whole scandal over him receiving gifts. Like, he had all these wealthy donors. And there's certain gifts that are improper to receive, or if you do receive them, you're supposed to like catalog them. I don't understand all the nuances of that. Like, there's a lot of laws around elected officials receiving gifts, as there should be, right? So, because you don't want corruption or even the perception of corruption. And so he got like this whole wardrobe and these really expensive glasses and like Taylor Swift tickets. And like, he had a whole bunch of things, or like his son was studying for a test. And so like, a donor like let his son stay in some fancy mansion or something like that. These details are a little sketchy because it's a couple of years ago now. But like, basically he got a whole bunch of goodies when he was elected, and there was this big scandal over that. You could accuse him of being like Stalin because he got his beak wet, but then Stalin got away with it, and Starmer's probably not.
Well, Stalin got away with it until he's dead. Right. And then,
yeah.
But after Stalin dies in 1953, there's this whole de-Stalinization. They denounce Stalin. They tell everybody within the system, like, okay, it was terrible. We got to move on from him. Right. And so his body used to be next to Lenin, right? In the mausoleum they have there, the Red Square. Not in the same mausoleum, but next to him. But then his body is removed at night, supposedly, and then so his stature is definitely greatly reduced after he's dead. But then, and then they kind of clean house and they try to, move on from him. But there's still a little bit. Again, that's just So Stalin gets away with it while he's alive.
Prime ministers in the UK, they're usually in power for a few years and then they're gone. And not one yet has managed to stay in power after his position or her position has become untenable. Napoleon and Stalin both did things like canceling or manipulating elections and, kind of cutting the bourgeois classes out and just basically having the ruling class do everything. I will say, I think some of the accusations against Starmer, you can make a fair argument here, because he has tried to do things now with not a lot of success in certain areas. Like, one thing he tried to pass early on was digital ID. And this would basically be like forcing everyone in the country to have sort of the digital equivalent of like the barcode in Idiocracy, where, obviously in Idiocracy, it's done as a joke. It's a tattoo, but it's not that far off, where like everyone would have to have this digital ID. Everyone would have to have a smartphone, and you'd basically end up having to keep it with you 24 hours a day for your entire life, because it's how you would access your bank accounts, educational stuff, your
Hmm.
medical records and appointments. So that this would tie like everything, all of your vulnerable information into one location. And when people were like, how are you going to keep that secure? He's like, oh, it'll be secure. And everyone's like, how? And he was like, it'll be secure. And people were just like, we don't believe you.
Right.
Um, because that's a very tall order. Like, even if you have the best of intentions, you're going to tie someone's bank account, their access to healthcare, their ability to travel, their passport, their identity documents in one location. Like, that's incredibly vulnerable. So there was a huge outcry from that, from people who were big on like civil rights. They said you shouldn't force people to do this. And so he had to backtrack. So I would say where, Stalin or Napoleon would have gotten their way. So there was that. And then another thing he did try to do is, in a couple of days, there's going to be local elections around here. And Starmer had tried to just cancel them. And as it happens, it's extremely likely that Starmer's party is going to get clobbered in these elections, right? So this was a very anti-democratic. It doesn't matter that these people were only going to be in power for like a year or so. That's not the point. You don't just get to cancel elections. And so he did show that tendency, like Stalin and Napoleon, but he had to backtrack on it because there's pushback, and I don't remember if a lawsuit was actually filed or not. There's just so much going on, right?
There is a parallel happening over here in the United States where that it's all pretty much you never know, but all the polls are showing that the Republicans are going to get clobbered this November. Just for those that for your non-American audience, since like World War II, um, only two for the party that holds the White House. Only two or three times have they not lost seats in the House of Representatives. So it is a trend, but they're saying that this is going to be absolutely devastating because of all the promises that Trump and his administration have not followed through or actually countered. But you were talking about canceling elections and what he has to backtrack, and that is one difference. We were talking a little bit before that he is not Stalin because Starmer has he's in a form of government that has existed before him. And there's tradition and culture and expectations and laws that are now wedded within Great Britain or England itself. Same thing with the United States. For however you want to view Trump and administration, whether they're authoritarian-like or fascistic-like, there's still the Constitution that they have to wrestle with. Where if you go back to, with Napoleon the Pig, the Soviet Union came from a system that was absolute monarchy. That was the czars for several centuries, and then you have Lenin come in, which they did not have a tradition, a culture of liberalism, little L, form of government. So it's easier for them, for Napoleon to just get what he wants because that is the system that the culture is used to. Same thing happened with I know it's a tangent. Same thing would happen with Germany, right? They had a history of Prussia, the king, the Kaiser, right? They only had 20 years of a liberal democracy, and so it wasn't them. So it's easier to overthrow or buck the liberal system when it's not part of your history.
That's a really, really good point. Is that, yeah, these cultural traditions and norms run really, really deep, and it's very, very difficult to fight against those. And then, on top of that, you have the systemic structures, like the actual structures of government that check power. So yeah, no, that's a really, really good point.
Just one thing for people that throw labels around is one, it's simplistic, but it still works. The difference between communism and socialism, I learned a couple of semesters ago that socialism wants to enact things through law, through the system by law. Communism is about enacting those same ideals, but through violence and through revolution. So that is a big difference. So whenever I hear here in the States, like, oh, such and such is a communist, I'm like, do you know what that word means?
Well, I mean,
Is he calling
often they
for
don't.
over? Yeah, but is he calling for the overthrow of the government and violence in the streets to enact? No. So yeah,
And I would say, like, in terms of bringing it back to Starmer, Starmer very much is a believer in the process. I feel like even though I'm a total outsider, I'm not a citizen, I can't vote here, but I think he is a guy who definitely wants to operate within the framework of law, so much so that he wants layers of law upon law. Like, he was a big fan of the European Union and fought against Britain leaving the European Union. And the European Union is basically like a government for your government.
yeah.
So he wants to work within the process. So that is an interesting comparison, is that so while Napoleon and Stalin are firmly in favor and not even trying to hide the fact that they feel that brute force is the best way to achieve their ends, that's not Starmer. Starmer's definitely a process oriented guy who I would say almost works within the law to the point that it hampers him politically sometimes. I will say there have been several examples of him throwing people under the bus or expecting them to fall on their swords for him. Like, I won't start getting into the names or listing, but many high ranking people have either been kicked out of their jobs or expected to fall on their swords for him. And I don't know how often Stalin, like, did he command that kind of loyalty or did he just get rid of people when he didn't need them anymore?
He's paranoid. So any inkling of disloyalty, or even because he needed to get rid of them, he just got rid of them. Like again, kind of going back to the Stalin purges, he eliminated Red Army officers that had went on the Soviet Union's behalf to work with the Germans during the 1920s. But later, right, it's politically uncomfortable to have that relationship, so that they got rid of you. One thing I always thought it was interesting was, with modern technology, with photoshopping, I would tell my cadets, like, go look, just go search Soviet Union image propaganda, and you'll see Stalin eliminate people in photos. Like there's this very famous photo of like when he starts getting rid of people. Well, he can't be next to him in a photo. So there's this one where he's like at a table, like, looking smart with four other people. And then the next version of the photo, there's three people. And then there's two. And then eventually, after a couple of years, there's just him at the table. Like, where'd everybody else go?
Yeah, and that's very much the concept that George Orwell would go on to explore in 1984 with the memory hole. Starmer would he there's no indication that he's a guy who is physically and personally violent in any way. I've never gotten that impression about him at all. I like again, I try not to give him a backhanded compliment. I don't he doesn't strike me as the fighting type, right? So he has gotten rid of people's, but it's interesting comparing, like, the concept of a purge, where Stalin's purges were unfair. When Starmer was brought in as the leader of the later Labor Party, it was specifically to clean up. Their previous leader had had some scandals, among which anti-Semitism. And so when Starmer joined the Labor Party, he did execute a purge in that he revoked membership, which is, not at all anywhere near the sort of purge that Stalin engaged in. And the thing is, though, the difference is that he was instructed to do that, and that was the will of the party collectively. It is fair to say that this is a guy who thinks that he wants to design a perfect system, and if everyone can just get in the perfect system, everything will be great. But then what do you do with the fact that there's a lot of people who don't want to be forced into certain systems and see the things that he's doing as fundamentally against great traditions, right? Like another thing that they've done is abolished most forms of jury trial. Now, this was something that was guaranteed in the Magna Carta. So this is like an 800-year-old tradition in Britain, that you have the right not to be tried by the state, but by your peers. This feels authoritarian. There are legitimate arguments here that I respect, but I don't like political name calling. And so when I see memes that call him Keir Stalin, some of them are funny. Look, they're funny. They're funny. They're clever. But it's an ad hominem attack at the end of the day. And given how crazy things can feel and how rapidly dehumanization can lead to political violence, I'm opposed to name calling. So in principle, I object to the idea of calling him Keir Stalin. And then in terms of the specific application, he's not fearsome. He doesn't seem to have terribly really strong principles in certain areas, and he's frequently criticized as being weak or appearing weak. Even labor voters don't like him anymore.
The thought about memes, it's there's memes and then there's political artwork, right? And where you draw a fine line where sometimes a political artwork can be very smart and very intuitive. Like I recently just saw Banksy put up a statue of a guy in a suit carrying a flag marching off the podium like he's going to fall off, and the flag is in the guy's face. So it's a political message that I think it has an artistic value to it that can be a smart message. Where memes, it's more about mockery, right? So I don't know. It's the intent of a political cartoon. It could be provocative and smart and communicate a lot. And I mean, that's why propaganda works, right? Left or right. But then you also have memes that are more about mockery. You can split hairs, have a discussion about that. Then I was thinking about, the leadership style you mentioned that he doesn't seem like, again, from the readings they did, Stalin was in person, wasn't physically imposing like, they made him out to be, but he was charismatic, right? And he knew how to read, my impression, he knew how to read the room. And for how terrible he was, for him to come out on top after Lenin has a stroke and he can't speak and he can't say he doesn't want Stalin, right? And to make it out of there as the leader does say to his political abilities to survive in that type of atmosphere.
Well, and I think that's a good point to end on, is that so we will see very soon, because for a while now, I mean, some of it's wishful thinking by right-leaning commentators, but even a lot of like more moderate and left-leaning commentators are just like, how much longer can Starmer hold on? And I think that's going to be the interesting thing, is does he have the ability to be a political survivor? Obviously, he won't in the way that Stalin did, because Stalin was able to stay in office till he died. But it will be interesting to see, because I thought about delaying our conversation until Starmer was out of office, but then I realized I don't know if he will be, because there's not really anyone quite ready to shove him out of the way yet. But we'll see if that happens.
Mm-hmm.
It'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next couple of weeks here in Britain. But thank you so much for joining me. This was really fun. This is definitely a tangent away from what I usually do, but I've really been enjoying taking this deep dive into Animal Farm, and it was nice to get such a grounded real world question. And I'm very grateful that I had a friend like you to turn to, who happens to be a literal, actual PhD expert in this time period. So thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for bringing me back.
All right. Well, we'll have to have you back soon for another movie night.
Definitely. Yes, I know I have a lot on my list.
Maybe when you're done with your PhD thesis.
Maybe.